In 1998, American luxury was splitting in two directions. One direction pointed toward front-wheel drive, unibody platforms, and European-style driving dynamics. The other held its ground on body-on-frame construction, rear-wheel drive, and the specific kind of isolation that only a ladder frame between the road and the passenger could provide. Lincoln chose the second direction. The third-generation town car launched that year as the clearest possible statement of what that choice meant. It would remain in production for 13 years. It would outlast most of the arguments made against it. And then, in 2011, Ford shut the line down. So, why does a car that never stopped working, never stopped serving the people who needed it, simply get discontinued? To understand that, we have to go back to 1998, and to the car that made the argument possible in the first place. The third-generation town car arrived that year without apology. It was body-on-frame, rear-wheel drive, powered by a 4.6-liter V8 that had no interest in impressing anyone at a stoplight. The wheelbase measured 117.7 inches, which made it one of the longest production sedans available to an American retail buyer that year. None of those choices were accidents. Every one of them was a decision made deliberately by engineers who understood exactly who was going to sit in this car and what that person expected the moment the door closed. That rear seat is where the story begins, because the town car was never really a driver's car. It was a passenger's car. The extended wheelbase existed for one reason, which was legroom. The frame was stretched at the rear door section, and those additional 3 inches compared to the Crown Victoria went entirely into the rear passenger compartment, not into the trunk, not into the engine bay, into the space where the person being transported would actually sit. The Cadillac DeVille was the town car's most direct competitor through this era. And the contrast between the two cars was a genuine philosophical argument about what luxury meant. The DeVille ran a front-wheel drive layout with a North Star double overhead cam V8. It was technically sophisticated. The automotive press noticed. Period road tests consistently framed the DeVille as the more modern of the two, the car that pointed forward, the car that had caught up with the Europeans. Lincoln's response was not to match the DeVille's technology. The response was to hold the line on body-on-frame rear-wheel drive construction and argue, through the car itself, that the DeVille's approach was answering a question nobody in a town car's rear seat was actually asking. A rear-wheel drive body-on-frame sedan does something that a front-wheel drive unibody cannot fully replicate. The latter frame separates the body from the road, not partially, but structurally. The noise, the vibration, the texture of the pavement, the shudder from a pothole, all of it has to travel through the frame's perimeter rails before it reaches the cabin. Much of it never arrives. What the rear passenger feels is a softened, filtered version of the road. And that filtration is not a tuning choice. It is a consequence of the architecture itself. The Cadillac could be tuned to approximate that quality. The town car delivered it as a structural fact. That difference was the town car's entire argument. It was not nostalgia. It was not a failure to modernize. It was a competing vision of what the word luxury was supposed to mean, built into the frame of the car before a single interior component was ever fitted. Understanding why that argument eventually lost requires going back to the platform that made it possible. The Panther platform had been in production since the late 1970s, and by 1998, that age was either its greatest liability or its greatest asset, depending entirely on what you needed from it. Ford's engineers understood the distinction. The platform was not carried forward because retooling was expensive, though that was true. It was carried forward because it delivered something that newer architectures genuinely could not match for the town car's specific purpose. A perimeter ladder frame, with the body mounted on top through rubber isolation points, created a cabin environment that absorbed and dampened road input before it ever reached the occupants. That is not a marketing description. It is a physical consequence of putting a separate steel frame between the road and the passenger compartment. The town car's version of the Panther frame was not identical to the Crown Victoria's. The wheelbase extension added approximately 40 pounds to the frame's mass, which contributed to the town car's curb weight sitting between 4,400 and 4,600 pounds, depending on trim. That weight was not inefficiency. It was the physical cost of the isolation the platform provided. and for the buyers and operators who chose this car, it was a cost worth paying without a second thought. The rear suspension told the rest of the story. Where the Crown Victoria used conventional coil springs at the rear axle, the town car used airbags. Load leveling was the function, and load leveling mattered enormously once the car left the dealership and entered commercial service. A limousine carrying 4 passengers and luggage sits differently than an empty one. With coil springs, the rear drops under load and the car's attitude changes, along with its ride geometry and the quality of what reaches the rear seat. With airbags maintaining a constant ride height regardless of load, none of that happens. The car rides the same empty or full, and the rear passenger experiences the same filtered, consistent motion at the beginning of the trip and at the end of it. That air system had a documented failure mode. The rubber bladders aged, typically somewhere between 10 and 15 years, and when they failed, the rear of the car would settle and eventually ride on its bump stops. The failure was gradual enough to be visible before it became severe, and both a replacement air spring and a permanent coilover conversion were available through multiple suppliers. The commercial viability of those coilover conversion kits says something specific about how often the air system failed. A conversion kit business only sustains itself if the problem it solves is common enough to create consistent demand. The engine calibration followed the same logic as everything else on this platform. The 4.6-liter single overhead cam V8 produced 220 horsepower at the town car's 1998 launch, lower than what the same basic engine produced in the Crown Victoria Police Interceptor. That difference was not a cost reduction. Ford calibrated the engine specifically for each application. The police car needed peak power and the ability to accelerate hard under sustained load. The town car needed low RPM torque that felt smooth and unhurried when carrying passengers at highway speeds. Same displacement, same architecture, different philosophy expressed through the tune. The 4-speed 4R75 on-W automatic transmission completed the picture. Shared with the Crown Victoria, the Grand Marquis, and Ford's full-size trucks, its durability record in commercial service was documented rather than assumed. The platform was designed to last. Whether the market would last long enough to reward that commitment was a different question entirely. But engineering is only half the story. A car built to this standard, with this level of durability designed into every component, does not attract one kind of buyer. It attracts the specific kinds of buyers who need exactly what it offers and will not accept a substitute. In 1998, Lincoln had 3 of them. The town car's survival through 13 years of production was not carried by any single group of buyers. It was carried by 3 simultaneously, and the economics only worked because all 3 were present at once. The first group was the retail luxury buyer, older, typically, than the buyers the industry was beginning to court. Someone who had owned town cars before, who knew what the rear seat felt like after a long drive, and who had no interest in trading that experience for a sport-tuned suspension and a lower roofline. This buyer existed in meaningful numbers through the late 1990s and into the early 2000s. They were loyal, they were consistent, and they were aging. The problem was not that they stopped buying town cars. The problem was that nobody younger was waiting to replace them. The second group was the livery and transportation market, and this is where the town car's engineering decisions paid off most directly. New York City black car fleets ran town cars in stop and go. Manhattan service year-round on multi-shift schedules. Fleet service records from commercial operators documented original drivetrains going past 200,000 miles without major powertrain work. The transmission required fluid changes. The front ball joints were at around 80 to 100,000 miles, consistent with what the platform was known to produce under sustained load cycles. The air suspension eventually needed attention, but the fundamental drivetrain, the 4.6, and the 4R75W simply continued operating. For a fleet operator, that durability was not a feature, it was the entire business case. A car that required an engine rebuild at 120,000 miles was a car that cost money the margin on a car service could not absorb. A car that ran its original drivetrain to 200,000 miles and beyond, on parts sourced from the same supply chain that served the F150, was a car that an operator could build a business around. Those 3 extra inches of wheelbase in the rear compartment, the load-leveling rear air suspension, the low RPM torque calibration that made crawling through midtown traffic feel effortless rather than labored, all of it translated directly into the reason a livery operator chose the town car over every alternative available to them. The third group was quieter, less discussed, and arguably the most stable of all 3. Funeral homes and the hearse conversion market had requirements that had not changed in decades and would not change regardless of what happened to the broader luxury sedan market. A hearse conversion begins with a body-on-frame platform because a unibody structure presents serious engineering challenges when extended to accommodate a casket. The latter frame can be cut and extended without compromising the vehicle's structural integrity in the way that modifying a unibody would require. The town car's extended wheelbase and frame construction made it a natural fit for coach builders, and the commercial chassis program Ford maintained through authorized builders, including Hess and Eisenhart, gave those coach builders a consistent supply of platforms to work with. The funeral home segment did not follow economic cycles the way retail luxury sales did. It did not migrate to SUVs when SUVs became fashionable. It needed what the town car provided, and it needed it for reasons that had nothing to do with consumer preference or market trends. That stability was the quiet foundation beneath the more visible retail and livery volumes. Ford understood the arrangement. The company's livery and upfitter documentation, published for commercial operators, specified approved modifications, expected service intervals for professional duty cycles, and component life expectations in concrete operational terms. Ford did not accidentally serve these markets. It engineered for them, documented for them, and built a commercial chassis program specifically to sustain them. Through the late 1990s and into the early 2000s, the balance held. Then the numbers started moving. The 2003 model year town car was the clearest statement Lincoln ever made about what this car was supposed to be. Not a refresh in the typical sense, where a headlamp cluster gets updated and a press release calls it new. A genuine rethinking of the formula, applied to every surface the occupant could see or touch, while leaving the mechanical philosophy underneath completely intact. The exterior was restyled from the front fascia back. New headlamps, a revised grille treatment, updated rear bodywork. The changes were measured rather than dramatic, which was appropriate for a car whose buyers were not looking for drama. What mattered more was inside. The instrument panel was new, the seat designs were revised, the acoustic insulation was improved, adding material in specific locations to reduce the road and wind noise that period critics had noted in the earlier car. The 2003 interior is the town car most people picture when they picture a town car. It is the version that defined the car's final identity. The suspension calibration was revised as well. Body roll had been a consistent criticism of the pre-2003 car and road tests, and the 2003 revision addressed it without changing the fundamental ride character that made the car worth building in the first place. The result was a town car that felt more composed through corners without feeling any firmer over rough pavement. That is a difficult balance to achieve, and the fact that it was achieved on a platform approaching its third decade of production says something about what experienced engineers can extract from a known architecture when they are given clear objectives and the freedom to pursue them. The THX certified audio system, available as an option through the mid-2000s, addressed a different kind of criticism. European luxury sedans were receiving premium audio, navigation, and connectivity systems as standard equipment, and the gap between those interiors and the town cars was becoming harder to dismiss. THX certification was not a marketing label applied to an existing system. The process required acoustic measurement of the town car's specific cabin geometry, followed by audio system calibration and component specification to meet THX's defined output standards within that exact interior. The certification was specific to this car's dimensions and materials. It documented a performance test, not a brand association. Taken together, the 2003 revision was a serious effort to extend the town car's relevance without abandoning the reasoning behind its existence. Lincoln was not pretending the car was something it wasn't. The body-on-frame platform stayed, the rear-wheel drive stayed, the V8 stayed, the extended wheelbase stayed. The argument remained the same. Lincoln had simply sharpened the way it was being made. The The 2003 car was the best town car Lincoln ever built. It arrived just as the company that built it was beginning to run out of time, but the market was moving, and it was not moving towards sedans. The luxury SUV segment had been growing through the late 1990s, and by the early 2000s it was no longer an emerging category. It was the category. Buyers who might once have considered a town car were considering something with a higher seating position, a third-row option, and the vague sense that they were driving something more capable, even if they would never test that capability. The town car's rear seat legroom and acoustic isolation were genuine advantages over anything an SUV could offer a rear passenger. The market had stopped asking the rear passenger for an opinion. The retail buyer demographic was aging, and younger buyers were not arriving to replace them. The 2003 car gave those existing buyers every reason to stay, and many of them did. What it could not do was manufacture new ones. That particular problem had no engineering solution, and Lincoln had no answer for it. What Ford did have was a clear view of the sales data, and what the sales data was beginning to show was a picture that no refresh, however thorough, was going to change. Ford was watching, and Ford was calculating. By 2006, Ford Motor Company was not managing a business. It was managing a crisis. The company mortgaged everything it owned that year to secure a $23.6 billion credit facility. Everything included the Blue Oval trademark itself, the name that had been on American cars since 1903, signed over as collateral to keep the lights on. That is not a metaphor for financial pressure. That is what financial pressure looks like when it has reached the point where ordinary measures are no longer available. The decision that followed was not complicated. When a company of that size is operating under that kind of constraint, the question stops being which products are good and starts being which products justify their existence on a balance sheet. Every vehicle in the lineup gets measured against every other vehicle by the same criteria: margin per unit, volume potential, investment required to keep it competitive. The products that score well in all three categories receive resources. The products that do not get rationalized, which is the corporate word for discontinued. The town car's position in that analysis was not difficult to read. Retail sales had been declining since the early 2000s. The private buyer who had sustained the nameplate through the 1990s was older, buying less frequently, and not being replaced by anyone younger in meaningful numbers. The livery and fleet volumes were holding, but fleet pricing is structured differently than retail pricing. Fleet operators negotiate volume discounts. The per-unit contribution from a livery sale was not what it was from a retail transaction, and the retail side of the ledger was the one that had been shrinking for years. Ford's answer to the luxury sedan segment was the Lincoln MKS front-wheel drive, a 3.5-liter twin turbo EcoBoost V6 unibody construction. It was everything the town car was not, and that was precisely the point. The MKS was designed for the buyer the industry had decided mattered, which was someone younger, someone interested in technology and driving dynamics, someone who found the town car's emphasis on rear seat comfort irrelevant because they were sitting in the front. The MKS could not serve the livery market. That was not a secondary consideration. It was a structural fact. Rear-wheel drive was not optional for a car service operator whose business model depended on the driving dynamics and load characteristics of a rear-wheel drive platform. Body-on-frame construction was not optional for the hearse coach builders whose modification process required a frame they could cut and extend. The MKS had neither, which meant that when the town car ended, the commercial operators who had sustained its production volume for a decade had nowhere to go within the Lincoln lineup. Ford announced the town car's discontinuation in 2008. The timing coincided with the financial crisis, which made it easy to read the decision as an emergency measure, a car cut because the company needed to survive. That reading is not wrong, but it is incomplete. The retail luxury sedan segment had effectively ceased to exist as a meaningful revenue source for this platform before the financial crisis arrived. The 2008 announcement confirmed what the sales data had been showing for years. The crisis accelerated the timeline. It did not change the destination. What the announcement actually said, beneath the language about strategic focus and product portfolio alignment, was something more direct. It's said that the traditional American luxury sedan, built for rear seat passengers, built on a body-on-the-frame platform, built around the specific qualities that made the town car what it was, had no future in Ford's calculation of where profitable volume would come from. Not because those qualities had stopped working. The car still did exactly what it was designed to do. But the number of people willing to pay for what it did had dropped below the threshold where the investment made sense. The retail buyer had already left. The spreadsheet had caught up. Production would continue through 2011 to fulfill existing fleet contracts and honor the commercial chassis program's remaining obligations. But the outcome had been decided, and everyone involved understood it. The question that remained was what the final years actually looked like, and what the car left behind when the last one rolled off the line. The decision was made, but the assembly line did not stop. For 3 more years, the town car continued doing exactly what it had always done, quietly, professionally, for the people who still knew its value. That is not a footnote. That is the most honest summary of what this car was. Production ran through 2011 on schedule, which is worth pausing on for a moment. Ford announced the discontinuation in 2008, and then continued building the car for 3 more years. That is not indecision. That is the commercial chassis program, and the fleet contracts requiring fulfillment. And it is evidence of how deeply the town car was embedded in operational commitments that could not simply be switched off because a product line decision had been made at the corporate level. The final trim hierarchy carried the designer series at the top of the range, replacing the Cartier designation that had defined the top specification through most of the production run. Exclusive exterior color options, distinct interior materials, specific badging. The changes were refinements rather than reinventions, which was appropriate for a car in its final years. The designer series exists today in the used market as a specific object of interest, not because it performs differently from any other late production town car, but because a VIN code can confirm that a given example is among the last of a nameplate that ran continuously for 30 years. That kind of provenance commands a premium in collector markets, and the town car is no exception. The commercial chassis program continued briefly beyond the retail end date. Limousine coach builders who had purchased chassis through 2012 required parts supply for the vehicles they had built and sold, and that demand kept certain town car-specific components in production into the middle of the decade. Air spring bladders, body trim items, electrical components. Every retail town car owner who sourced an OEM part after 2011 was quietly benefiting from the limousine industry's ongoing need for the same components. The commercial operators who had sustained the platform's production economics were now, in a final irony, sustaining the availability of parts for the retail owners who remained. What those operators filled the gap with, once the town car was gone, tells its own story. Foreign-built limousines entered the segment. SUV-based alternatives became the standard offering for car services and hotel fleets. The specific qualities that had made the town car the default choice for professional rear passenger transport, the body-on-frame isolation, the load-leveling rear suspension, the extended wheelbase rear compartment, were simply unavailable in any domestic successor. The market adapted because it had no other choice, not because the replacement was better at the specific job the town car had done. The used market that followed the discontinuation developed its own logic. Fleet-retired examples with documented service histories began moving through auction channels into private ownership. A livery town car with 200,000 miles and a complete commercial maintenance record is a different object from a privately owned example at the same mileage with gaps in the service history. The fleet car was maintained on a professional schedule because a business depended on it. That discipline is embedded in the documentation, and buyers who understood the platform's durability record recognized what that documentation represented. The coilover conversion market continued to grow through this period, which is its own form of monument to the air suspension's failure consistency. Multiple suppliers maintained town car-specific conversion inventory. The commercial viability of that market required a failure rate common enough to sustain consistent customer demand. And the air suspension delivered exactly that. Owners who performed the conversion accepted the loss of load leveling in exchange for a rear suspension that would simply never fail the same way again. That trade was being made regularly enough to keep several businesses profitable. The car had been gone from production for years, and the aftermarket built around its known failure modes was still healthy. The town car's end was not the end of a car. It was the end of a position. There had been a clear argument embedded in the town car's architecture from the first day of third-generation production. The argument was that luxury, properly understood, meant something specific. It meant the person in the back seat arriving at their destination the same way they left. Unhurried, undisturbed, the road a rumor rather than a fact. That argument required a body-on-frame platform to make structural. It required rear-wheel drive to execute correctly. It required an extended wheelbase to deliver the space the rear passenger actually needed. None of those requirements were negotiable, because the moment you compromised any one of them, you were no longer making the same argument. You were making a different car. What replaced it was a different argument entirely. The crossover and the luxury SUV did not compete with the town car on its own terms. They changed the terms. The new question was not, how comfortable can the rear seat be, but how high can the seating position be? How configurable can the interior be? How modern does the exterior profile look from the street? Those are legitimate questions. They simply have nothing to do with what the town car was built to answer. The shift from body-on-frame, rear-wheel drive, sedans to front-wheel drive, unibody crossovers gets described in the automotive press as a consumer preference story, which is accurate as far as it goes. Buyers chose differently, and manufacturers followed. But there is another layer beneath the preference story, and it is a margin story. Crossovers returned higher profit per unit than traditional sedans at the volume levels the market was producing. That gap mattered enormously to a company operating under the kind of financial pressure Ford carried through the mid-2000s. Preference and profitability pointed in the same direction, which meant the sedan's advocates inside the company had no argument left that the balance sheet would accept. The irony the town car's story leaves behind is specific and worth naming plainly. The car that survived longest on the fleet and funeral home economics, the car that the livery operator and the coach builder kept alive long after the retail buyer had moved on, was the car that understood most clearly what the person sitting in the back seat actually needed. The passengers who rode in town cars through 30 years of the nameplate's life were not consulted when the decision to end production was made. The buyers Ford was trying to attract with the MKS were. The new buyers wanted to drive. The town car had spent 3 decades being perfect for people who wanted to be driven, and that distinction, so obvious from the rear seat, was invisible from a position on a product planning spreadsheet. The last town car built at St. Thomas in 2011 did not know it was the last one. The platform did not know the argument had been lost. The air suspension maintained its ride height. The V8 idled quietly. The rear doors opened wide. Everything worked exactly as intended, right up to the moment the line stopped. What ended in 2011 wasn't just a model. It was the last American luxury sedan built around the conviction that the passenger in the back seat deserved better than whatever the driver happened to enjoy. That philosophy had a platform, a frame, a wheelbase, and a V8 tuned for refinement rather than performance. It had 30 years of nameplate history, and a commercial operator network that understood its value better than the retail market ever fully did. The accountants won, as they usually do, but the car made its argument completely, and anyone who has sat in a town car's rear seat on a long stretch of highway already knows exactly what was lost. Now, click on this next video if you want to see how, in 1989, Toyota did something no one thought possible. They built a luxury car that outperformed Mercedes and BMW and cost half as much. This is the story of the Lexus LS 400, a car built when durability mattered more than profit margins, and why that philosophy has been largely abandoned.